On the evening of December the 25th, 1991, the red banner bearing the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the final time. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, the eighth and last leader of the Soviet Union, sat in his office signing the decree that would dissolve the state he had sworn to preserve. Within hours, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics would cease to exist, ending 7 decades of communist rule and fundamentally reshaping the global order. To millions of Soviet citizens who watched their world collapse, to party faithful who had dedicated their lives to the communist cause, and to hardliners who had attempted a desperate coup just months earlier, one question burned with particular intensity. Had Gorbachev deliberately destroyed the Soviet Union? Or had he simply lost control of forces he never truly understood? The answer requires examining not just the final chaotic years of Soviet power, but the deep structural problems that Gorbachev inherited when he assumed leadership on March 11, 1985. At 54 years old, he was the youngest member of the Politburo to take supreme power since Stalin, and he inherited an empire in crisis. The Soviet economy had been stagnating for over a decade, with growth rates declining from 6% in the 1960s to barely 2% by the early 1980s. The war in Afghanistan, which had begun with the Soviet invasion in December 1979, was draining approximately $5 billion annually from the state budget while producing nothing but body bags and demoralized soldiers. The technological gap between the Soviet Union and the West was widening dramatically, particularly in computers, telecommunications, and consumer goods. Most critically, the oil prices that had buoyed Soviet finances throughout the 1970s had collapsed, falling from $35 per barrel in 1980 to less than $10 by 1986, decimating the primary source of hard currency earnings. Gorbachev came to power as a reformer, but not as a revolutionary. His early biography offers crucial insight into his worldview. Born in 1931 in the village of Privolnoye in Stavropol Krai, he had lived through the worst of Stalinism, including the famine that devastated the region and the arrest of both his grandfathers during the Great Terror. Yet he had also benefited enormously from the Soviet system, gaining admission to Moscow State University in 1950, where he studied law and met his future wife, Raisa Titarenko. He joined the Communist Party in 1952, just months before Stalin's death, and rose steadily through the party apparatus in Stavropol, demonstrating both competence and political acumen. His patrons included Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chief who briefly led the Soviet Union from 1982 to 1984, and Mikhail Suslov, the chief ideologist of the Communist Party. These connections brought Gorbachev to Moscow as a full member of the Politburo in 1980, making him one of the youngest men in the gerontocratic leadership. When Gorbachev assumed power, he genuinely believed that the Soviet system could be reformed and revitalized. His initial program centered on 2 Russian words that would become globally recognized: perestroika, meaning restructuring, and glasnost, meaning openness. The logic seemed sound to him and his circle of advisors, which included economists like Abel Aganbegyan and political strategists like Alexander Yakovlev. They believed that the Soviet economy was failing because it lacked accountability, innovation, and honest information flows. Factory managers routinely falsified production figures. Workers had no incentive to improve productivity because everyone received similar wages regardless of effort. And the vast bureaucracy suppressed any initiative that might threaten established hierarchies. Gorbachev's solution was to introduce limited market mechanisms, allow more honest discussion of problems, and empower local managers to make decisions without constant reference to Moscow. The first major reform came in May 1985 with an anti-alcohol campaign designed to improve labor productivity and public health. Gorbachev, influenced by his wife Raisa's strong views on the subject, ordered the closure of vodka distilleries, restricted sales hours, and increased prices dramatically. The campaign was a disaster. It cost the state treasury approximately 100 billion rubles in lost revenue between 1985 and 1988, drove alcohol production into the black market, and generated widespread resentment among ordinary citizens who saw it as puritanical interference in their lives. More significantly, it established a pattern that would repeat throughout Gorbachev's tenure: well-intentioned reforms that failed to account for how the Soviet system actually functioned, producing unintended consequences that worsened rather than improved conditions. The economic restructuring that began in earnest in 1987 proved even more problematic. The law on state enterprises, enacted in June of that year, was supposed to give factory managers more autonomy and make enterprises responsive to market signals rather than central planning directives. Instead, it created chaos. Managers now had authority to set their own production targets and negotiate contracts, but they still operated within a system where prices were fixed by the state. Supplies were allocated by planners, and there was no functioning market to coordinate economic activity. The result was a hybrid system that combined the worst aspects of central planning and market economics. Enterprises hoarded supplies, produced goods that nobody wanted because they were more profitable than needed items, and the overall coordination of the economy began to break down. By 1989, consumer goods shortages had become severe, with basic items like soap, matches, and sugar disappearing from state stores. Glasnost, however, was where Gorbachev truly opened Pandora's box. Initially conceived as a limited opening to allow criticism of bureaucratic inefficiency and corruption, glasnost rapidly expanded beyond anything Gorbachev had intended. The watershed moment came with the Chernobyl disaster on April 26, 1986, when Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine exploded, releasing massive amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The initial Soviet response followed traditional patterns of secrecy and denial, but Gorbachev, facing international pressure and recognizing that the truth would emerge regardless, eventually authorized unprecedented openness about the disaster. This decision fundamentally changed the relationship between the Soviet state and its citizens. If the government had lied about Chernobyl, what else had it lied about? The floodgates opened. By 1987 and 1988, Soviet publications were printing articles that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. Newspapers discussed Stalin's crimes in detail, including the Great Terror, the Ukrainian famine, and the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that had divided Eastern Europe between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union in 1939. Magazines published critiques of Lenin himself, questioning the very foundations of Soviet legitimacy. Television programs showed the poverty and dysfunction of Soviet life with brutal honesty. Memorial, an organization dedicated to documenting Soviet repression, was founded in 1987 and quickly attracted massive support. The historical revelations were particularly devastating because they destroyed the legitimizing mythology that had sustained communist rule. Generations of Soviet citizens had been taught that they lived in the most advanced, most just society in human history. The temporary hardships were necessary sacrifices for the glorious future being built. Now they learned that their grandparents had been murdered by the millions for no reason, that the party leadership had always lived in luxury, while ordinary people suffered, and that the entire historical narrative they had been taught was a lie. Gorbachev's foreign policy decisions further undermined Soviet power. though they won him international acclaim. In December 1987, he signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with United States President Ronald Reagan, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons. This was followed by the announcement in February 1988 that Soviet forces would withdraw from Afghanistan, a process completed by February 1989 after a decade of futile war that had cost approximately 15,000 Soviet lives and perhaps 1 million Afghan lives. These decisions were rational responses to unsustainable situations, but they shattered the image of Soviet strength and resolve. If the mighty Soviet Union was retreating from Afghanistan and making major concessions in arms negotiations, perhaps it was not so mighty after all. The most consequential foreign policy decision came with Gorbachev's approach to Eastern Europe. Since the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had maintained control over Eastern European satellite states through a combination of economic integration, political pressure, and the implicit threat of military intervention. This threat had been made explicit in 1956 when Soviet tanks crushed the Hungarian Revolution, and again in 1968 when Warsaw Pact forces invaded Czechoslovakia to end the Prague Spring. The doctrine, articulated by Leonid Brezhnev, held that the Soviet Union would not permit any socialist country to abandon communism. Gorbachev repudiated this doctrine. In a speech to the Council of Europe in July 1989, he declared that every nation had the right to choose its own path, and his spokesman, Gennady Gerasimov, jokingly referred to the new policy as the Sinatra Doctrine, after the song My Way. This was not betrayal in Gorbachev's mind, but rather a recognition of reality. The Soviet Union could no longer afford to maintain its empire by force, and Gorbachev believed that reformed, liberalized communist governments in Eastern Europe could survive without Soviet bayonets. He was catastrophically wrong. In Poland, the Solidarity movement forced the communist government into negotiations that led to partially free elections in June 1989, which Solidarity won overwhelmingly. In Hungary, the reformist communist government began dismantling the border fence with Austria in May 1989, creating a hole in the Iron Curtain through which East Germans began to flee. The East German communist regime, led by the hardline Erich Honecker, faced growing demonstrations throughout the summer and fall of 1989. When Gorbachev visited East Berlin in October for the 40th anniversary of the German Democratic Republic, he publicly warned Honecker that life punishes those who come too late, effectively signaling that Soviet troops would not intervene to save the regime. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. The images of Germans dancing on the wall, smashing it with hammers and pickaxes, were broadcast around the world. Within weeks, communist regimes across Eastern Europe collapsed like dominoes. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution peacefully overthrew communist rule in November. Bulgaria's longtime leader, Todor Zhivkov, was ousted the same month. Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu was overthrown and executed in December after a brief but violent uprising. By the end of 1989, the Soviet external empire had effectively ceased to exist, and Gorbachev had done nothing to stop it. To hardliners in Moscow, this was the ultimate betrayal. The Soviet Union had sacrificed enormously to create this buffer zone against Western power, and Gorbachev had simply let it go. But the external empire's collapse was merely a prelude to the disintegration of the Soviet Union itself. The USSR was not a nation-state, but a multinational empire, comprising 15 republics and dozens of ethnic groups. The largest republic, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, contained about half the total population, but the other 14 republics had their own distinct identities, languages, and histories. Soviet nationality policy had always been contradictory, simultaneously promoting local cultures and languages while ensuring Russian dominance and Communist Party control. Glasnost and perestroika destabilized this delicate balance. If people in Moscow could now openly discuss Stalin's crimes and question communist ideology, why couldn't Ukrainians discuss the artificial famine of 1932 to 1933 that had killed millions? Why couldn't the Baltic peoples of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania discuss their forcible incorporation into the Soviet Union in 1940? Why couldn't Armenians and Azerbaijanis resolve their dispute over Nagorno-Karabakh without Moscow's interference? The first major nationalist explosion came in Kazakhstan in December 1986, when Gorbachev replaced the longtime Kazakh party leader Dinmuhamed Kunayev with an ethnic Russian, Gennady Kolbin. Riots broke out in Almaty, the Kazakh capital, resulting in several deaths when security forces intervened. This was followed by escalating tensions in the Caucasus, where the simmering dispute between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the predominantly Armenian region of Nagorno-Karabakh, located within Azerbaijan, erupted into violence in February 1988. Gorbachev's response was ineffectual, neither granting Armenian demands for the region's transfer nor suppressing the nationalist movements decisively. The violence escalated, culminating in pogroms against Armenians in the Azerbaijani city of Sumgait in February 1988, and later in Baku in January 1990. The Baltic republics presented an even more fundamental challenge. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had been independent nations between 1918 and 1940, before being absorbed into the Soviet Union as a result of the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They had never accepted Soviet rule as legitimate, and glasnost allowed them to say so openly. Popular fronts formed in all three republics during 1988, initially claiming to support Gorbachev's reforms, but increasingly demanding full independence. On August 23, 1989, the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, approximately 2 million people formed a human chain stretching 600 kilometers from Tallinn in Estonia through Riga in Latvia to Vilnius in Lithuania, in a peaceful but powerful demonstration called the Baltic Way. In March 1990, Lithuania declared independence, followed by Estonia and Latvia. Gorbachev declared these declarations invalid and imposed an economic blockade on Lithuania. But he was unwilling to use the level of force that would have been required to reverse them. The critical turning point in the Soviet Union's disintegration came with the rise of Boris Yeltsin and the assertion of Russian sovereignty. Yeltsin, a former Gorbachev ally who had been removed from the Politburo in 1987 after criticizing the slow pace of reforms, had reinvented himself as a populist champion of Russian interests. In June 1990, the Russian Republic declared its sovereignty, asserting that Russian laws took precedence over Soviet laws within Russian territory. Since Russia comprised 3/4 of Soviet territory and over half its population, this declaration effectively meant that the Soviet Union could not function. Yeltsin was elected chairman of the Russian Supreme Soviet, giving him a democratic mandate that Gorbachev, who had never faced a competitive election, lacked. The stage was set for a power struggle between Gorbachev, trying to preserve some form of union, and Yeltsin, increasingly committed to Russian independence and his own political supremacy. Gorbachev's position became increasingly untenable throughout 1990 and 1991. He faced pressure from hardliners who wanted to restore order and central control, and from reformers and nationalists who wanted to accelerate the dissolution of Soviet power. He attempted to navigate between these forces through a series of contradictory moves. In November 1990, he appointed hardliners to key positions, including Boris Pugo as Interior Minister and Gennady Yanayev as vice president. In January 1991, Soviet special forces killed 14 Lithuanian civilians in an assault on the television tower in Vilnius, an operation that Gorbachev claimed to have not authorized, but that clearly served hardline interests. Yet, simultaneously, he continued negotiating a new Union treaty that would have dramatically decentralized power, transforming the Soviet Union into a loose confederation. The hardliners struck on August 19, 1991, just one day before the new Union Treaty was scheduled to be signed. The State Committee on the State of Emergency, comprising 8 senior officials including Vice President Yanayev, KGB Chairman Vladimir Krychkov, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, and Interior Minister Boris Pugo, announced that Gorbachev was ill and that they were assuming emergency powers. Tanks rolled into Moscow, and troops occupied key locations. The coup plotters were remarkably incompetent, failing to arrest Yeltsin or cut communications effectively. Yeltsin famously climbed atop a tank outside the Russian parliament building and called for resistance to the coup. Crucially, significant portions of the military refused to follow the coup plotters' orders, and after 3 days of confusion and sporadic violence that left 3 civilians dead, the coup collapsed. Gorbachev returned to Moscow on August 22, 1991, apparently believing he could resume his position. He was delusional. The coup had destroyed any remaining legitimacy of the Soviet system and demonstrated that Gorbachev had lost control entirely. Yeltsin publicly humiliated him, forcing him to read aloud the minutes of a cabinet meeting that showed how many of Gorbachev's appointees had supported the coup. Over the following months, republic after republic declared independence. Ukraine, the second-largest Soviet republic, held a referendum on December 1, 1991, in which more than 90% voted for independence. This was the death blow. A Soviet Union without Ukraine was not viable economically, politically, or strategically. On December 8, 1991, Yeltsin met with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus at a hunting lodge in the Belovezha forest and signed an agreement dissolving the Soviet Union and creating the Commonwealth of Independent States. Gorbachev was not consulted. He protested that the agreement was illegal, but he had no power to prevent it. On December 25th, he resigned as president of a country that no longer existed, and the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time. So did Gorbachev betray the Soviet Union? The question itself reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of what occurred. Gorbachev did not set out to destroy the Soviet system but to save it. He recognized, more clearly than his predecessors, that the system was failing and that without fundamental reforms, it would collapse. His tragedy was that he never understood that the Soviet system could not be reformed incrementally. The command economy, the one-party state, the imperial structure, and the communist ideology formed an integrated whole. Once you allowed people to speak freely about the system's failures, once you admitted that the party had lied about history, once you permitted even limited economic autonomy and political pluralism, the entire structure began to unravel. The Soviet Union was not a normal state that could evolve gradually toward democracy and markets. It was a revolutionary regime whose legitimacy rested on the claim to be building a radically new form of society. When that claim lost credibility, when people stopped believing in the communist future and learned the truth about the communist past, there was nothing left to hold the system together. Gorbachev's critics on the left argue that he should have pursued reforms more cautiously, maintaining political control while gradually opening the economy. His critics on the right argue that he should have moved faster toward full democratization and market economics. Both critiques miss the essential point. There was probably no path that could have preserved the Soviet Union once the process of opening began. The structural problems were too deep. the accumulated lies too extensive, the suppressed national identities too powerful, and the gap between Soviet reality and Soviet propaganda too wide. The Soviet Union in 1985 was not a healthy patient needing minor surgery, but a terminal case where any treatment would likely prove fatal. The consequences of the Soviet collapse have shaped the world for 3 decades and continue to do so. For Russians, the 1990s brought economic chaos, political instability, and a profound sense of humiliation as their superpower status evaporated. This experience directly enabled the rise of Vladimir Putin, who has built his legitimacy on promises to restore Russian greatness, and who has explicitly called the Soviet collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. For the former Soviet republics, independence brought both opportunities and challenges, with the Baltic states successfully integrating into Western institutions, while Central Asian republics fell under authoritarian rule, and the Caucasus experienced devastating conflicts. For Eastern Europeans, liberation from Soviet domination allowed them to rejoin Europe and build democratic societies, though the transition was often painful, and the legacy of communism persists. For the West, the Soviet collapse brought a brief moment of triumphalism, a belief that liberal democracy and free markets had won permanently, a delusion that has been shattered by the revival of authoritarianism and great power competition in the 21st century. Gorbachev himself lived to see all of this, dying in August 2022, at the age of 91, just 6 months after Putin launched the invasion of Ukraine, that Gorbachev had helped make independent. He remained convinced that his reforms had been necessary and correct, that the alternative would have been violent collapse rather than the relatively peaceful transition that actually occurred. Whether history will judge him as a visionary who ended the Cold War peacefully, as a naive reformer who lost control of forces he unleashed, or as a traitor who destroyed a superpower, remains contested. What is certain is that Mikhail Gorbachev, more than any other individual, presided over one of the most dramatic transformations in modern history, the end of an empire and an ideology that had shaped the 20th century. He did not betray the Soviet Union through malice or design, but through a fatal combination of good intentions, inadequate understanding, and the impossible task of reforming a system that could not survive the truth about itself.